Today I want to talk about the 1978 Commonwealth Games, which was wedged between the Montreal Olympics and the Moscow Olympics. Consequently, a number of manufacturers in the photographic industry used it as a development tool for product. In those days, Nikon had the field. This camera here was the trump for everybody who travelled and worked in press work and allied areas like sport, etc. Commercial photography, by and large, in those days was still in the roll film days. 35mm didn't come along till a lot later. This camera by Canon was around at the same time, and it was the camera, the AE1, that became the platform for research for everything else that came after. It was the first camera to have a microprocessor in it. And the development of the AE1 provided Canon with the information and the technology to develop the A1, which is the camera that was released in 1978 in April, and in August 1978 we got our hands on it pretty much as a test for Canon. They were the official suppliers to the games, and everybody scooped them up with glee. At the same time, they were developing a 300-2.8 fast lens and an 800-5.6, and if I recall, I think there was a 500 or a 400 somewhere in there too. Some years later, Canon went on to build what became their flagship camera, the F1, which was a wonderful piece of camera gear. And at the time, when I went back to Hong Kong, which is where I was living at the time, I couldn't wait to get my hands on, firstly, a 300-2.8, and a little while later, the new F1. And this is what it looks like. This is the 300-2.8 as they first were made, with a manual wind camera on the back. Normally there was a battery pack on the bottom here which held 12 AA batteries. This whole thing weighed close to 3.5 kilos, which was quite a difficult bit of gear to lug around. The fast long lenses were something fantastic, and they were a revelation. Kodak at the time also, at the same games, was getting ready for its appointment as the supplier for Moscow some 2 years later, and they developed fast transparency film for the first time. Most film of a high rating ISO was black and white. We'd never had fast colour film, colour transparency film, and Kodak provided at those games the first rolls of 400 ISO, or ASA in those days, transparency film. Once again, a revelation. I came to the Commonwealth Games with a background in Melbourne doing sports photography for The Age. Sports photography is an area where it's actually my favourite area of photography. If I had my choice, that's what I would have done my entire career. Primarily because you can't do anything but get the picture. You can't light it. Beyond choosing where you sit or where you decide to put the camera, that's it. Everything else is out of your control, and it's only your skill that makes the difference between good pictures and rubbish. The Canon equipment that we were supplied with allowed most of us to really experiment and take advantage of perspectives that we'd not had before, and with the fast transparency film, do things in low light that we weren't able to do before. And I'll show you a few pictures of mine from the book which we all went to work on. The 800mm comes into terrific effect with the high jumper, and also the day I shot the road racing bicycles, the weather was appalling, but we still got a picture. It wasn't the most technically proficient, but it made a good image. You wouldn't think by photographing badminton you could end up with much. But if you watch closely and you take note of what people are doing, you can get a picture like this. This bloke made this shape every time he had an overhead smash. And it was just a matter of moving around, waiting until he did it, and there you go. Of course, the weightlifter, those things you just got to be ready for. You work with and against sometimes some terrific photographers and some great personalities. Two stood out immediately for me. One was Chris Haney, who came to us as a photographer in those days from the Montreal Gazette. He went on to become famous years later because he and his brother actually invented Trivial Pursuit. And I think at some stage he gave up photography not long after that. Mike Evans was there also. Mike was an English-born fellow who lived in New York and became some years later the White House photographer for Ronald Reagan. At the time, in '78, he was Reagan's personal photographer and followed him around in his role as Governor of California. The other photographer that sticks in my mind, Russell McPhedran from Australia. He took the picture that people regard as the most famous by any Australian photographer and the most recognisable. He was on his lunch break in the Munich Olympics and happened to be in the area when things went very bad. He took the famous picture of the terrorist with the hood over his head, leaning over the balcony. A quiet fellow, loved a drink, but a fine photographer. And so it turned out to be, despite all of us young people being there with all this new equipment. Russell scooped us all in the semi-final of the 100 metres, and he got us all completely. He shot it head on and everyone else shot it from the side, and he got the picture. No one else did.